Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale inspires, challenges, and moves us. In today's story, we follow James McCarter, a retired Marine seeking peace in the small town of Maple Creek. What begins as a quiet new chapter quickly escalates into a fight against racism, fear, and corruption. As Mac stands up to a powerful family terrorizing the town, he not only reclaims his own dignity but helps a community find its voice. This is a story of courage, resilience, and the power of unity. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's journey. The first thing I noticed about Maple Creek wasn't its charm, though it had plenty of that. It wasn't the warm colors of the brick storefronts that lined the main street, or the lazy hum of cicadas filling the summer air. No, what struck me first was the silence, the kind that settles in your chest. Heavy and watchful. It was the kind of quiet that didn't just ask you to listen, it demanded it. I had just arrived in town. My truck packed with the remnants of my old life. Everything I needed, what little was left, was neatly tucked in the bed of the old Ford. A relic that had carried me through deployments and disasters alike. The Marine Corps cap on my dashboard reminded me of a past I was trying to leave behind. Maple Creek was supposed to be my fresh start. I'd spent 20 years serving my country, traveling the world, and learning the hard way that peace wasn't something you stumbled into. It was something you fought for, sometimes with grit, sometimes with patience, and sometimes by walking away. That's what brought me here, a quiet town on the edge of nowhere, where I could teach fitness classes at the community center and maybe, just maybe, let my soul catch its breath. The townsfolk didn't make much of me at first, and I didn't blame them. I was an outsider, a tall, broad-shouldered black man stepping out of a beat-up truck into a town where history was as old as the dust that coated the streets. The looks I got weren't hostile. Exactly. But they weren't welcoming either. A little too long. A little too curious. As if they were trying to decide whether I fit the picture of their little town. I thought nothing of it when I walked into the diner that day. It sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering against sun-bleached walls. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried food, comforting smells. Though they carried a strange tension here. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, greeted me with a polite smile. But there was a hesitance in her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "Please. And whatever special you've got," I replied, my voice steady, soft. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. I didn't think much of it then, adjusting the Marine Corps ring on my finger as I settled into the booth by the window. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where you could almost hear the whispers of 1,000 lives that had passed through. I didn't hear the gang come in. I felt them. The atmosphere shifted the moment the door swung open. Laughter, loud and grating, cut through the muted conversations like a knife. I glanced up just long enough to catch the leader's wiry frame and cocky swagger. Rick Saunders. I didn't know his name then, but I recognized his type. The loud ones always carried the deepest insecurities. The three of them, Rick, Jake, and Evan, made their way through the diner like they owned it. Rick caught my eye and smirked. A smirk that told me he'd already decided who I was. His kind always did. "Well, would you look at that?" Rick drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Big guy thinks he can take over our booth." I tightened my grip on the coffee cup. So much for a quiet meal. They loomed over my table, their presence as unwelcome as the stale smell of cigarettes that clung to their clothes. Rick leaned in, his grin widening as he tapped the table with his knuckles. "Hey, big guy," he sneered. Didn't know the circus was in town. I didn't look up, didn't flinch. I'd learned long ago that silence was often the best way to disarm a fool. But Rick wasn't looking for silence. He wanted a reaction. "What's the matter?" his friend Jake chimed in. His laugh just as grating. "Too busy counting calories to say hi?" They thought they were clever. They thought their words could rattle me. I took another sip of my coffee. My movements slow, deliberate. The calmness seemed to irritate them more than anything else. Rick slapped the table, his voice dropping to a growl. "Hey, I'm talking to you." I raised my eyes then, meeting his glare with a look that wasn't angry, but firm, a quiet, simmering patience. "I didn't realize this was your booth," I said evenly. "You want it? Take it. I'm just here to eat." For a moment, Rick's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, gesturing toward my broad frame with exaggerated disdain. "Nah, I'm good. Standing right here gives me a better view of whatever this is." His words drew laughter from his lackeys, but it was hollow, performative. They were playing a game, one they didn't realize I'd already won by refusing to play. "You done?" I asked, my tone calm but pointed. Rick's smirk twisted into something darker. "Not even close." And just like that, the air in the diner grew heavier. It wasn't just about the words anymore, it was about power, about control, and about how far Rick was willing to go to prove he had it. I wasn't looking for a fight that day, but sometimes, a fight finds you. Rick's smirk didn't waver as he leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, don't you? Big muscles, quiet attitude. Bet you think that makes you better than us." Jake snickered, nudging Evan, who stood a step behind. Shifting uncomfortably, Evan's nervous glance caught my attention. He didn't seem as sure about all of this, like he was being pulled along by Rick and Jake's bravado. I set down my coffee cup and leaned back slightly, giving them a long, measured look. "I'm just here for breakfast," I said, my tone steady, calm. "If you're looking for trouble, you're barking up the wrong tree." Rick laughed, loud and sharp, cutting through the room. "You hear that, boys? Big guy's got a backbone." He turned to Jake, gesturing toward me. "Let's see if it can hold him up." The room grew quieter. Conversations died as patrons turned their attention to us, their eyes filled with something between curiosity and dread. The waitress stood frozen near the counter, clutching her notepad, but she didn't move to intervene. Jake made the first move, his hand slapping the table hard enough to rattle my plate. "You don't belong here," he sneered. "This is our town. People like you don't last long." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and heavy. "People like you." I'd heard that before, in different tones and accents, in different places around the world. It wasn't just about me being an outsider. It was about my skin, my presence, my refusal to shrink myself to make them comfortable. I didn't flinch. Instead, I picked up my fork, cutting into the chicken fried steak on my plate. I ate deliberately, each bite slow, my calmness a sharp contrast to their growing aggression. Rick's patience snapped. He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound reverberating through the diner. "You don't get to ignore me. You hear? This is our town, our rules. You think you can just show up and act like you belong here?" I wiped my mouth with a napkin, finally looking up at him. My voice was quiet, but it carried. "I belong wherever I decide to be, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Rick's bravado faltered. His smirk twitched, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but pride wouldn't let him back down. He motioned for Jake and Evan to spread out, flanking either side of me. "You've got one more chance to walk out of here," Rick said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Otherwise, we'll show you how we handle people like you." I stood slowly, towering over Rick and his lackeys. My calm expression never wavered as I squared my shoulders and let my presence fill the space. "You want to make your point?" I asked, my voice steady. "Go ahead and try. But I'm warning you, you won't like how this ends." Rick's confidence cracked, but he lunged anyway, fists swinging wildly. The fight found me, and I met it head-on. Rick's fist came first, a wide, clumsy swing aimed at my jaw. It wasn't the first time someone like him had tried to prove something with a punch. And I doubted it would be the last. I stepped to the side, his momentum carrying him forward as I redirected his arm with a firm shove. He stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his face burning with humiliation. "You think you're tough? Heh!" Rick spat, his words trembling with frustration. "We'll see how tough you are when you're on the ground." Jake was next, his movements just as uncoordinated but driven by reckless aggression. He lunged at me, his fists flailing. I ducked under one swing, sidestepped another, and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs. He let out a grunt, doubling over and clutching his side as he staggered backward into a booth. Plates and cups clattered to the floor. Evan hung back, his fists half-raised, his body tense but unsure. I could see the fear in his eyes, the hesitation of someone who knew he didn't belong in this fight. "Evan, get in here," Rick barked, his voice laced with desperation as he threw another punch. This time, Rick managed to graze my shoulder, but it wasn't enough to throw me off balance. I caught his arm mid-swing, twisting it firmly but carefully to avoid causing serious harm. Rick cried out, his knees buckling slightly as I pushed him back. "You're out of your depth," I said, my voice calm but edged with warning. "Walk away before this gets worse." Rick's glare burned with anger, but he didn't respond. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it showed. Behind him, Jake was still catching his breath, his confidence drained, while Evan took another step back, his hands lowering. "Hey, stop it," a voice called out from behind the counter. It was the waitress, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly. "Take this outside before I call the sheriff." Rick hesitated, glancing around the diner as if only now realizing the attention they'd drawn. The other patrons sat frozen in their seats, their faces a mix of fear and relief. No one had moved to help me, but no one was cheering Rick on either. I let go of his arm and took a step back, giving him room to decide. "It's over," I said, my voice steady. "You've made your point. Now leave." Rick straightened, his breathing heavy, his fists clenching and unclenching as he weighed his options. Finally, he turned to Jake and Evan, his expression hard. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice low and strained. The three of them shuffled toward the door, Rick leading the way. He paused before stepping out, glancing over his shoulder with a glare that barely masked his frustration. "This isn't over," he said, his words like a promise. I sat back down as the bell above the door jingled, signaling their exit. The tension lingered in the air, but I picked up my fork and finished my meal in silence. If Rick wanted another fight, I'd be ready. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. Maple Creek had a way of pretending things didn't happen, a survival tactic born from years of ignoring the obvious. But I wasn't interested in letting things slide. Rick's parting words echoed in my mind, not as a threat but as a reminder this wasn't over. I started to notice things I hadn't before. My house, on the outskirts of town, sat at the end of a long dirt road. Twice that week, a car with its headlights off cruised by after dark, the laughter of its occupants faint but deliberate. They wanted me to know they were watching. I didn't flinch. If they wanted to intimidate me, they were going to have to try harder than that. At the community center, I began striking up conversations with people who seemed to know the undercurrent of the town better than most. Sandra, the receptionist, was one of them. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, the kind of person who saw more than she let on. One afternoon, as I was locking up after a fitness class, I found her waiting by the front desk. "You've stirred things up," she said, her voice low. "Didn't mean to," I replied, though I knew it wasn't true. "What do you know about Rick Saunders?" Her expression darkened. She glanced around, ensuring we were alone, before leaning closer. "Rick's not just some punk. His dad, Robert Saunders, owns half the businesses in this town. His uncle's on the council. They've got everyone under their thumb. And the police? I asked, already suspecting the answer. They look the other way, Sandra said with a sigh. Rick and his crew have been terrorizing people for years. Vandalism, threats, even violence. But no one talks. People are too scared of what the Saunders family can do. I nodded, filing the information away. Anyone I should talk to? Sandra hesitated before scribbling a name and a number on a piece of paper. David Jackson. He used to live here. His family was one of their targets. They moved after things got bad. But he might talk to you. That evening, I made the call. David's voice was cautious at first. But as I explained what had happened at the diner and what I was trying to do, he began to open up. The story he told me wasn't surprising, but it stoked a fire in me all the same. They targeted us the second we moved in, David said, his frustration palpable even over the phone. Slashed tires, graffiti, broken windows. The police didn't do a damn thing. Rick's uncle was at their barbecue the same weekend our garage was vandalized. We had a kid. Man, we couldn't take the risk. By the time we hung up, I had a clearer picture of the system I was up against. Rick wasn't just a bully, he was part of a network of fear and control. And I wasn't going to let it stand. The more I dug into Maple Creek's secrets, the clearer it became. Rick and his crew weren't just acting on their own. Their power came from the influence of the Saunders family, a name that carried both respect and fear in this town. I'd seen systems like this before, places where authority wasn't earned but inherited, where power was wielded to silence instead of protect. I knew I couldn't take them down alone. It wasn't just about muscle or bravery, it was about building something stronger than their fear. It was about giving the town a reason to speak out. The next morning, I drove to the auto parts store where Evan Miller worked. I'd seen the hesitation in his eyes during the diner confrontation. The way his hands trembled even as Rick barked orders. He wasn't like Rick or Jake, he was scared. Maybe even desperate for a way out. Evan was closing up when I approached, my boots crunching on the gravel lot. He froze when he saw me, his hand tightening around the keys in his grip. "What do you want?" he stammered, his voice shaky but defiant. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, holding up my hands in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk." He hesitated, his eyes darting toward his car, but something in my tone must have convinced him. He nodded reluctantly, shoving his keys into his pocket. "Fine. Talk. Rick and Jake aren't your friends," I began, keeping my voice low but firm. "They're using you. And you know it. When this all comes crashing down, and it will, they're not going to protect you. They'll leave you to take the fall." Evan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a shaky breath. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered. "Rick's dad, his whole family, they own this town. If I turn on them, they don't own you." I interrupted, my tone sharpening. "You have a choice. You can keep doing what they tell you, or you can do the right thing. But if you stay with them, you're going to go down with them." Evan stared at the ground, his hands fidgeting. The silence stretched between us, heavy and tense. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with something between fear and resolve. "What do you need me to do?" I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Tell me everything. What Rick's done, who's helped him, and how they've gotten away with it. The more you tell me, the better chance we have of stopping this." Evan nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to promise me they won't come after me." "You have my word," I said. "This is the first step. Evan, you're doing the right thing." That night, Evan told me everything. His confession was the key to a door I'd been trying to unlock, a door that led straight to the Saunders family. And now, I was ready to kick it open. Evan's confession opened my eyes to the scale of what Rick and his family had been doing. It wasn't just about bullying or vandalism, It was a well-oiled system of fear and corruption. Minority-owned businesses had been driven out, families threatened, and property vandalized, all to maintain control over Maple Creek. Worse, Robert Saunders and his brother, a councilman, had funneled money through fraudulent town projects to shield their operation from scrutiny. With Evan's testimony in hand, I knew I needed help from someone who could amplify this story. That's when I reached out to Eric Thompson, the young journalist who ran Maple Creek's modest newspaper. Eric had a reputation for poking around where others wouldn't. And this story was bigger than anything he'd ever handled. When I walked into his cluttered office, Eric looked up from his desk, skepticism written all over his face. "You again," he said, setting down his coffee mug. "What's this about?" I placed a folder on his desk, tapping it lightly. "This is about Rick Saunders, his family, and the stranglehold they've got on this town. If you want a story that matters, here it is." Eric flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. When I handed him the recorder with Evan's confession, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the play button. "Go ahead," I urged. "Listen." Evan's voice filled the room, shaky but resolute, recounting the harassment, vandalism, and the financial schemes orchestrated by the Saunders family. Eric leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from doubt to shock and finally to anger. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. "This," he started, his voice thick with disbelief. "This is huge. If even half of this holds up, it'll tear the Saunders family apart." "Good," I said. "The town needs to see what's been hiding in plain sight." Eric nodded, his initial hesitation melting away. "I'll fact-check everything. If it checks out, I'll run it and I'll make sure it gets to regional outlets. This story won't stay local." "Do that," I said, standing. "The more people know, the harder it'll be for them to bury this." The next step was the police station. I wasn't holding my breath for a warm reception. But I wasn't walking in empty-handed either. I met with Detective Collins, a grizzled officer who had seen too much and trusted too little. He eyed the folder I slid across his desk with suspicion. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof," I said. "Evan Miller's testimony, financial records, and everything tying Rick Saunders and his family to years of crimes in this town." Collins opened the folder, flipping through the pages with a careful eye. When he reached the transcript of Evan's confession, he paused, his fingers drumming the desk. "You've got a lot here," he said finally. "But you know how this works. Evidence doesn't mean much if the people pulling the strings are still in power." "That's why I came to you," I replied, meeting his gaze. "If you don't act, I'll take this higher." Collins nodded slowly. "Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do." As I left the station, I knew I'd started something that couldn't be undone. The pieces were falling into place, and the Saunders family's web of lies was beginning to unravel. But this fight was far from over. The days following Evan's confession were a whirlwind. Eric Thompson wasted no time. His article hit the Maple Creek Gazette with a bold, uncompromising headline: "Maple Creek's Shadow, the Saunders Family and Their Reign of Fear." It didn't just name Rick or his crew, it laid bare the entire system. Fraudulent town projects, intimidation campaigns, and the complicity of local authorities were all spelled out in black and white. The town buzzed with the energy of long-suppressed truth. At the diner, the grocery store, and the barber shop, people whispered about the article. Some seemed relieved, while others, those who had turned a blind eye for years, looked uncomfortable. But the whispers were growing louder. The community was waking up. Sandra at the community center was the first to openly acknowledge the change when I ran into her by the bulletin board. She smiled. The kind of smile that hinted at cautious hope. "You've stirred something in this town, James," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's not just me," I replied. scanning the notices for upcoming meetings and gatherings. People are tired of being afraid. She nodded. Maybe. But someone had to show them it was possible. Her words lingered as I prepared for the next step. The Saunders family wasn't going to sit back and let their empire crumble. I knew Robert Saunders well enough now to predict his moves. He wouldn't stay silent. He'd push back. And when he did, it wouldn't be subtle. 2 days later, I stood in the crowd outside Maple Creek City Hall as Robert Saunders took the podium. His suit was immaculate, his silver hair gleaming under the midday sun. Beside him, his lawyer and a few council members formed a united front. This was damage control. And Robert played the role perfectly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and practiced. "This past week has been a shameful display of overreach and misinformation. My son, Rick, has been wrongfully accused by outsiders who seek to disrupt the harmony of our town." I could almost feel the eyes in the crowd shift toward me. I stood near the back, arms crossed, my expression neutral. Robert's gaze never found mine, but his words were aimed directly at me. "These baseless accusations are a deliberate attempt to tarnish the reputation of my family," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "For generations, the Saunders name has been a pillar of this community. We will not be intimidated by false narratives." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others clearly skeptical. It was a performance. And Robert played it well. But the cracks were showing. The council members flanking him avoided eye contact, their discomfort visible. The town was beginning to question the power they'd allowed the Saunders family to wield for so long. When Robert finished, I caught Eric's eye in the crowd. The journalist scribbled furiously in his notebook, already preparing the next story. Robert Saunders had doubled down. And now it was time to push harder. That evening, I met with Detective Collins and Eric at the community center. The latest developments weren't just about Rick anymore, they were about dismantling the entire system of corruption that had held Maple Creek hostage. We went over the financial records again, connecting the dots between the Saunders family's fraudulent projects and the town officials who had turned a blind eye. "This is bigger than I thought," Collins admitted, his gruff tone tinged with unease. "If we take this to the DA, it's going to blow up." "Good," I said, my voice firm. "Let it. The town deserves the truth." The fight was escalating, but the momentum was on our side. For the first time, it felt like Maple Creek was ready to stand up. But I knew the Saunders family wouldn't back down without a fight. And neither would I. The Saunders family didn't waste time making their next move. The very next night, I heard the low rumble of a car engine outside my house. The sound of tires crunching gravel told me they weren't just passing by. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin, and saw the familiar headlights of Rick's car. The engine cut off abruptly, and the doors opened. Rick, Jake, and even Evan spilled out, their faces shadowed but unmistakable. Rick's swagger was more forced than usual, his steps heavy with pent-up anger. Jake followed closely, clutching a metal pipe in his hand, his jaw set in grim determination. Evan lingered behind them, hesitant, his eyes darting nervously between me and the others. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Rick called out, his voice slurred with fury. "You think you can ruin us and get away with it?" I didn't move from the porch, keeping my stance relaxed but ready. "I didn't ruin you, Rick," I said, my voice carrying through the night. "You did that yourself." Jake took a step forward, gripping the pipe tightly. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," he growled, his bravado faltering when I turned my gaze on him. "You're right," I said evenly. "I'm not messing with anyone. But if you're here to start something, you won't like how it ends." Rick snarled, motioning for the others to fan out. "Get him," he barked, his voice cracking as the words escaped his throat. "Show him what happens when you mess with us." Jake charged first, his steps heavy and uncoordinated, He swung the pipe in a wide arc, but I sidestepped easily, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The pipe clattered to the ground, and Jake let out a pained yelp as I shoved him backward. He stumbled, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the gravel. Rick didn't hesitate. He lunged at me with wild, flailing fists. But I'd seen this kind of desperation before. I blocked his swings with practiced precision, countering with a quick strike to his chest that sent him staggering back. His breath came out in short, ragged gasps as he glared at me, his face red with rage. Evan stood frozen a few feet away, his hands half raised, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. "Evan," I called out, my tone firm but calm. "You don't have to do this. Walk away now." Evan hesitated, his eyes flicking between me and Rick. "Don't you dare," Rick shouted, pointing at him. "If you run, you're dead." But Evan took a shaky step backward, then another, before turning and running into the darkness. Rick screamed after him, his words dissolving into incoherent rage. "You've lost, Rick," I said, my voice steady. "Take the loss and walk away." But Rick wasn't ready to concede. With one final, desperate cry, he lunged at me again. But this time, his movements were slower, sloppier. I sidestepped, grabbing him by the collar and pinning him against the side of his car. "This is over," I said, my voice low and firm. "You've done enough damage. It's time to stop." Rick struggled for a moment before going limp, the fight draining out of him. I released him, stepping back as he slid down the car to sit on the ground, his head in his hands. Jake was already scrambling to his feet, muttering curses under his breath. He helped Rick up, and the two of them staggered back to the car. They didn't look back as they drove off into the night. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. The confrontation was over, but the battle wasn't won yet. Rick and his family would keep pushing. But now, the town was watching, and so was I. As the sun rose over Maple Creek, the town felt different, lighter, freer. Rick and his gang were defeated, their reign of fear broken. The Saunders family's grip on the town was slipping, and the people of Maple Creek were finding their voices again. For me, this wasn't just a fight, it was a reminder that courage and unity could overcome even the darkest shadows. This was only the beginning of the town's journey to healing. But I knew they'd get there. Thank you for joining me on this story. If you want to hear more inspiring tales, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for our latest videos.